Hi everyone, and welcome back. You likely just finished part 1 of Module 1, where Jen walks you through some of the initial understandings of how we approach behavior in schools and in our classrooms. I'm now going to walk you through part 2 and part 3, where we'll look to answer a broad question. What are the elements of basic behavioral theory? The importance of this module in general, but also these next 2 parts, is going to be to get you up to speed with some critical content and some critical language that will carry us through the remaining modules. So first, we're going to look to our activity workbooks and look at activity 1.4, which is a stop and jot. What I will ask you to first do is to take a moment and consider what are some typical patterns of behavior you have seen in your own classrooms. Also look to reflect on the question, why do you think those behaviors are sustained and why do they continue in and around your school day? Welcome back. This slide, as you'll see throughout these modules, will be called an activity review or debrief slide. So first, let's talk quickly about what you may have come up with for your first activity. The leading question was, what are some typical patterns of behavior that you have seen in your classrooms? If you are either a new teacher or a veteran teacher, like all of us, you've probably seen a variety of student behaviors and adult behaviors in and around your classrooms each and every day. You may have come up with examples such as noncompliance, disrespect, pencil tapping, throwing objects, work refusal, swearing, elopement, the list goes on and on and on. The more important question is really, why do you think these behaviors occur in the first place, and why do they continue day in and day out and from one week to the next? A typical response will be, in one way or another, the behaviors that we're seeing, again from students and also at times from adults in our classrooms, that these behaviors work for that individual. Through our conversations in these modules, we're going to talk about a concept known as the function of behavior. Through these next couple parts, we're going to break apart behavioral theory a little bit and start to identify the ABCs of behavior. Ultimately, what we're looking to get at is this question. Why is this behavior currently working for the individual? What is the underlying function that drives and reinforces the sustained behavior manifestations? So in this module, we will explore the science behind behavior to help us better understand why students and teachers behave the way they do. First, let's take a step back and look from a very broad 10,000-foot view around the conceptual foundations of class-wide positive behavior interventions and supports. First, to ground us. From an umbrella standpoint, behavioral theory is what will drive much of our conversation. We will ground ourselves in the knowledge base that grounds behavioral theory, which is all behaviors serve a purpose or work for the individual. Behaviors are observable and measurable and can be defined based on the context from which that they are manifested. That comes from the big blue bubble in front of you, behavioral theory. From behaviorism and behavioral theory comes the world of ABA. Living and working in schools, we all know that ABA becomes a relied upon practice as we look to improve upon students' behaviors across the school day. From the world and practice of applied behavior analysis has come a deeper dive into positive behavior supports, a systems change, school-wide approach to improving pro-social behaviors with consistent contingencies for all staff and all students. We then there have our final bubble down here, the school-wide PBIS and class-wide PBIS, from which we'll be focusing on through this module and in the coming modules. Before we dive into some of the key components of behavioral theory and how behaviors can be broken apart and looked at and analyzed, the critical question is why does any of this even matter? Why does this matter to you? Typically, a good response to this question is somewhere along the lines of a basic understanding of the science of behavior change gives us the tools to observe, measure, monitor, teach, and correct behaviors more effectively and efficiently over time. This approach moves us away from perceptions, opinions, subjective visions of behavior, as well as assumptions about motivations or intentions, to a conversation that recognizes a few critical takeaways from behavioral theory. One, that all behavior is a form of communication for that individual. The individual is trying to either get or obtain something or avoid something. We'll talk more about that as we get into a conversation about function of behavior. Also, the understanding from behavioral theory is that all behavior occurs within a context. That context certainly comes with its own set of expectations and contingencies, and it is within that context the antecedents and consequences that either trigger and or maintain and reinforce the manifestation of that behavior over time. So, moving the conversation forward, a lot of the language pieces that we'll be talking about in this module and the next module may be a review for you or those around you in your group. For some of you, these language components might be brand new. The big hope and the purpose and goal for these parts are to move you forward with a conceptual understanding of how behavior operates and occurs in and around your classroom, so you might be able to look more closely at improving that behavior across time. So first, let's look at the building blocks of behavior. Many of you out there viewing this part have likely heard of the ABCs of behavior, or the antecedent, behavior, and consequence contingency. This is also known as the three-term contingency. So what I would like to do is break this down a little bit for you and explain what each of these boxes means in each of these words. First, let's start with the middle box, behavior. If I were to ask you to define behavior, you may come up with your own definition, and it might make a lot of sense. For purposes of consistency, let's adopt this definition. The behavior is the observable and measurable act of the individual in the context that the behavior is observed within. This is also called a response. The blue box, the antecedent, is the stimulus that immediately precedes the behavior that you're focusing upon. This is also known as the trigger. And finally, the red box, the consequence, is the stimulus change that occurs contingent on the behavior. Effectively, the consequence is what immediately follows the behavior that you're observing. In addition to the three-term contingency is this term known as a setting event. I'm not going to dive into a definition and an explanation of a setting event at this point, as we will cover this in future modules. So to break apart the three-term contingency, let's look at the ABCs given this brief scenario. This is Jonas. When Jonas is asked to complete an independent assignment, he disrupts his peers and refuses to begin the assignment. After his behavior, the teacher immediately sits with him and helps him complete the work. By looking at this brief scenario, can you identify the ABCs of behavior? First, what is the antecedent? The antecedent here is when Jonas is asked to complete an independent work assignment. Can you identify his behavior? Jonas's behavior is he disrupts his peers and refuses to begin his assignment. That's the behavior. And finally, the consequence. What occurs immediately following this behavior? The teacher sits with him and helps him complete the work. So effectively, given this brief scenario, you can identify the A, B, C of this contingency. Let's look at another one. Here we have Emily. At home, Emily has several chores. She has to feed the dog, do her laundry, clean up her room. On Monday, Emily was tired. Her mom reminded her to do her chores, but Emily said no and went up to her room. When Emily's favorite episode came on TV later, she was not allowed to watch because her chores were not completed. Take a look at this scenario, this example, and see if you can quickly identify the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. First, the antecedent is here. Emily's mother reminded her to do her chores. That is the trigger that led to Emily's behavior, which was her saying no and going up to her bedroom. Following that, the consequence then becomes Emily losing access to her favorite TV show, which came on television later that evening. So again, another quick example of how you could identify the antecedent, behavior, and consequence, or the ABCs of a brief behavioral episode. What I'm going to have you do now is turn to activity 1.5, which is a workbook quiz in your workbooks. What we're going to be looking to do across the next few activities is breaking apart and identifying the antecedents, that's for this activity, the behaviors, as well as the consequences. For this activity, 1.5, let's see if you can identify the antecedent or the trigger within each brief scenario. I'll walk through the first couple together with you and then turn the rest off for you to complete independently. Item number 1, the teacher said line up, and the students pushed in their chairs and made a line at the door. The underlined green words, teacher said line up, would effectively be the trigger or the antecedent to this example. Example 2, the teacher said put your books away, and the students put their books back in their backpacks. What do you think would be the antecedent in this example? If you underline the teacher saying put your books away, you would be correct. Please now go to your workbook quiz and see if you can identify and underline in examples 3, 4, and 5 what you believe to be the triggers or antecedents in these brief examples. Welcome back. If you've completed activity 1.5, it's now time to turn to activity 1.6. We're now going to move beyond the idea of identifying antecedents or the triggers given the examples, and now look at what are behaviors. So remember back to the beginning of this part, within this module, we talked about all behaviors can be operationalized. They can be defined. In order to be defined operationally, we need to identify that the behavior is both observable and measurable. So what I'm going to ask you to do here is look at a few different scenarios or lists of potential behaviors and identify which one does not belong. Which one is not a behavior that you could observe and measure if you were asked to. The first group, hits, spits, angry, and bites. Second group, hurts, cries, slaps, and whines. And the third group, smiles, laughs, wiggles, and is happy. Take a few moments now, go to your activity workbook, and try to complete activity 1.6 on your own. Welcome back. At this point, you likely have finished activity 1.6 independently or with those that you're working through this part with. Let's see what you came up with for your answers. Number 1, hits, spits, angry, and bites. Which one of those examples is not an observable and measurable behavior? Answer should have been angry. Angry certainly probably could be operationally defined, but as it stands here, you might have different interpretations of what angry looks like across individuals and across contexts. Therefore, it's circled as an unoperationalized behavior. Number 2, hurts, cries, slaps, or whines. For this one, you should have circled hurts. And finally, for number 3, smiles, laughs, wiggles, and happy. Ideally, you would have circled the last one, happy. All of these examples are words that do not fit within the context of identifying an observable and measurable behavior. Therefore, a little more work would be needed in order to have consistent understanding of what that behavior looked like across time for an individual in the environment or the context that you were observing it. Next, we're going to look at behaviors a little bit more and look at activity 1.7. Within this quiz in your workbook, look to see if you think any one of these is observable and measurable. For each one, next to it, write down yes, no, or unsure. Once you had a chance to do that independently, we'll come back and we'll debrief it together as a group. Okay, so welcome back. Let's walk through these 7 examples and identify whether or not you think that they are observable and measurable. Number 1, the student gets out of desk and hits other students. Is that observable and measurable? I would say yes, so I've highlighted it in green, as I believe that is fairly observable and measurable. You can, in your mind's eye, think about what a getting out of a desk behavior would look like and hitting another student. That certainly would be observable and measurable. Number 2, the student has school phobia. I highlighted that as a red, meaning that is not observable and measurable. The idea of school phobia could be extended for sure in conversation and dialogue to make it observable and measurable, but as it stands right now, not observable and measurable. Number 3, spacey. Now if you think about the word spacey, I highlighted this one orange as kind of a maybe observable and measurable, because again, I think this is not currently to the level of understanding that would be objective across observers. Spacey has a good starting place. That maybe is the title of a behavior. However, it's not something that is observable across specific dimensions of behavior and wouldn't be consistently observed by different observers. Therefore, I'm going to say this one is not quite observable and measurable. Number 4, student reads 120 words per minute. That one is green. I think you could agree that that is observable and measurable. Number 5, student says she hears voices. Highlight that one orange. Again, if the student is reporting and self-reporting that they're hearing voices, you might be able to observe that. You might need to go a little bit deeper on how you could reliably observe and record that across time. So that is orange. The student is emotionally disturbed. I highlighted this one red. This is not observable and measurable. Again, this is an understanding the student may have behavioral challenges that have been sustained across time. However, it's not something that you could certainly walk into a classroom and objectively identify the emotionally disturbed behaviors of any one individual. Therefore, it remains red. And finally, doesn't like classmates. Similarly, this is a subjective statement inherently, not easy for an observer to walk in and clearly identify and reliably track when a student doesn't like another student. That would be a subjective observation, a qualitatively based observation, and not something that could be reliably measured across time. Therefore, this one also is red. It is not observable and measurable. Activity 1.8 is going to look at consequences. Remember, we've now so far looked at antecedents or triggering events. We've identified behaviors as observable and measurable. With this workbook quiz, we're going to look at what is the consequence. So similar to the antecedent activity and quiz, we're going to look to underline and identify the consequence condition within each of these brief examples. So number one, after the students lined up, they were allowed to go to recess. So quickly, you probably now can almost fluently identify the antecedent or trigger here. You can likely see the behavior that's at play. So I'm going to ask you to do is to underline what is the consequence that occurred immediately following the behavior. You may have underlined the students were allowed to go to recess. That is a consequence or the outcome that came immediately following the students' behavior here, which was them lining up at the door appropriately. For these next 4 examples, look to turn individually to your workbook quiz and underline the consequences that occurred immediately following each behavior from each scenario. Okay, welcome back. We're now going to quickly move into activity 1.9. Here, we're actually going to look to evaluate the ABCs of a video example, video scenario provided to us from Dr. Terry Scott, who is the Associate Dean and Professor of the University of Louisville. Dr. Scott has put a lot of time into developing some high-quality videos that can certainly go beyond this particular part of this module to give you further practice. But to get us started, we're going to view 2 brief videos. The first one we'll work through together, identifying the ABCs of behavior from the scenario, discussing them briefly. I will then turn the second scenario off to you to work on either independently on your own or with those working through this part of the module with you.
All right, guys, I like the way everybody's working, but it's time to go to the assembly, so I'm going to have you guys go ahead and line up at the door, please. Hey, Roy, what's everybody else doing right now? Lining up, exactly right. Can you show me how that works? Perfect. Good lining up, Roy. Okay, guys, ready to go?
Okay, so a nice short video clip of a pretty common, pretty typical experience teachers face every day in their classrooms. Here, Dr. Scott is looking to get his entire class up to the door to line up to leave. Everyone's doing independent seat work, and he, of course, has the one student who is not listening. So first, let's look at the antecedent. Here, the teacher said, it's time for the assembly, and most students stopped working to line up at the door. The behavior of our student was then he continued working individually and independently at his work, at his desk, and did not comply with the teacher directive or prompt to line up at the door. So, what happened immediately following that behavior? We saw Dr. Scott, as the teacher, come in and ask him to show him how to line up at the door, and the student then complied and went and lined up at the door. So, there you have the ABCs of this very brief scenario. Again, a very common scenario and sequence I think that you likely see in your classrooms every day. And that's as simple as it is to break down a behavioral sequence between the antecedent, the trigger, the observed behavior, and the immediate consequence. Keep in mind and underscore from this example that the consequence was what occurred immediately following the student's challenging behavior. In this scenario, the student's challenging behavior was them not complying with the directive to line up. So Dr. Scott coming and re-prompting that student to show him how to line up was the immediate consequence. In a bit, in the next part of this module, we'll talk about what kind of function that would be for the student. Effectively, if you are thinking ahead, your comment might suggest here that Dr. Scott, as the teacher, provided the student some adult attention. So keep that in mind as we move forward with this module. Now, continuation of activity 1.9, I would ask you to turn to the video clip, video number 2, play it to yourself and see if you can identify independently and individually the ABCs of this next scenario.
Okay, guys, we're getting ready to go to lunch. I want to remind you about a couple of things. First of all, when we go down the hall to lunch, do we walk or do we run?
Walking.
Okay, that's correct, Jim, but we're going to be raising our hands. So there's one time this morning that you haven't. But that is correct, we're walking. Here's my next question. When we're walking down the hall, should we have an outside voice or an inside voice? What is it? Inside voice. Good job raising your hand there, Jim. There's one, you raised your hand there this time. So 1-1, good job. All right, one more question before we go. When we get down to the cafeteria, should we run in or should we wait in line at the door? Thanks for raising your hand, everybody. Jim, that's the second time you raised your hand. Great. What's the answer?
Wait in line at the door.
Wait in line at the door. That's right. Excellent job. Okay, so let's get ready to go. That was 2 and 1. Great job this morning, Jim.
If you haven't had a chance already, try to identify another person working through this part with you to compare your responses. You may have noticed that there are a variety of ABC sequences across this very short video clip. I'll give you a hint. What you're looking to identify is a target student that Dr. Scott keeps coming back to and reinforcing for raising their hand. Look at the first time that he's given the group a prompt, a question, and how he responds to the student who has not raised his hand. That effectively will be your ABC sequence.